Episode 4, Walk, Don't Run. I still remember publishing my first collection of poetry. I say publish somewhat loosely. It was a self-published collection, roughly stitched together and thrown on Amazon Kindle. I'm not even sure why I decided then and there to publish the collection. I'd been writing, mediocre poetry for decades. I just felt like I needed my work in the world, immediately. And I feel that way still, the need to make an impact with my work now. It reminds me of a moment in college, actually, that has stuck with me for, almost 25 years. It was an educational and necessary moment, if also excruciating. This was my life plan at the time. Speed through undergrad, get an MFA in creative writing, concentration in poetry, then get a PhD in theology and teach at a prestigious university. As junior year approached, my final year of college, thanks to some credit-heavy quarters and a lot of AP classes, I prepared my dog-eared portfolio for MFA applications. Now, in this portfolio, I combined the best of what education taught me was great about poetry, or at least what I thought was great about poetry. Flowery verse, composed in homage to the decomposed greats, Keats and Wordsworth. And there were titles in my portfolio that were really ridiculous. Things like Ode to a Sunday Morning and To John Wilmot in Defense of Reason. Very self-important titles. And I was proud of this work. It knitted together $100 words, nimble rhyme. It did its wet behind the ears best to capture the sublime of 2003 in soggy Bellingham, Washington. Admittedly, not so sublime. But I was confident in this work, so I made an appointment with one of my idols in the English department, who was one of those scruffy professors with an MFA and the vague aloofness, kind of aloofness that I am convinced is required of any modern poet. We sat in his office on a dark afternoon, and he flipped through my poems. No expression. About halfway through, he set my portfolio down on his desk and stared at the floor. And after a pregnant pause, he looked up. "Do you see that computer in the corner?" he pointed. I looked over and saw some early 90s clunker in the shadows. "Turn it on," he told me. So I did, flipping a comically oversized on-off switch at the back, and I let it boot up, watching the neon green lettering tap across the screen. DOS 1.0 or some such. And when the boot had completed, the professor asked me to type in a command, followed by a random topic. So I followed his instructions, and in just a few seconds, a 3-stanza poem was staring back at me. "Read it," he said. So I did. And it was, contrived, robotic, what you would expect from a machine. But still, on some level, it was impressive. It captured the topic that I fed it and wrote something that was coherent, even vaguely clever, could be argued. "That poem," the professor said, "is better than what you've given me." It created an imitation, too, of what it thinks poetry is. It just has a lot more source material to work with. Now that painful, very blunt session made it clear to me that my poetry was version 1.0. There wasn't really any me in it, just bad impressions of people who had been dead for centuries. So this set me on a crusade to write about me things, my long-distance boyfriend at the time, my struggles with religion, my homosexuality, my lust for doing something grandiose in the world. And it all fell flat. Still writing in crazy romantic verse. Well, I will say it mostly fell flat. And even when it didn't really, it was just kind of like a leaky balloon, losing air quickly. Catch a verse here and there that I thought was good, that was truly me. For the most part, nothing great. As you can imagine, I did not make it into graduate school for creative writing. And I went a different path, first in theology, then culinary arts, then a life of adulting, as we all do. Nothing terribly grandiose. But I tried to return to the me time and time again. And this was the portfolio of work that I cobbled together for Amazon Kindle. Well Water and the Tide, I called it, my first collection of poems, a chapbook of sorts. And there was little thematically to tie it all together, except that from where I sat at the time, it was the best of me in verse. Unfortunately, it was still crap. I mean, I look back on that poetry and cringe, but it did mark a shift, a new chapter in my poetry writing. Fast forward to today, I've published a few more things on Amazon Kindle, books of prayer, books of crazy, outside-the-box, madman poetry, and books of reflection that combine the genuine me that I have been working on with practical application, like a specific collection of meditations designed to help those suffering with anxiety, my personal demon. It's called Nighttime Verses if you're interested. But outside of these, I still find myself reaching for something because my poetry isn't there yet. It's not quite. And I read Mary Oliver and Billy Collins. I even dig up new talents, generally hate their work, but I dig them up and I read them. And I still return to the greats like Emily Dickinson and T.S. Eliot, and I fall in love with their poetry all over again, the way they use language and verse and expression. Some days I use this, I'm inspired by this, and create something that's truly worth the pause, or a wry smile or a laugh. Usually not, but sometimes. Last December, I turned 42. It's hard to know that and not think one of two things. One, I failed at this poetry thing. I mean, by God, Keats was a poetry genius and died before 30. There's no hope left. I should just focus on something else. Or two, poetry, good poetry, is going to take a lot more time than I thought. Makes me think of a mantra that surfaces more and more for me every day. Walk. Don't run. We all have a general habit of racing here in the Western world, race for professional advancement, financial security, relationships, family. We all feel it. I probably don't need to tell you what we all have known intellectually for some time. Racing makes it difficult to enjoy the journey. Racing is about getting somewhere fast. But the only place we're all going, without question, is death. So why aren't we spending more of ourselves on the journey? Sure is an easy concept to understand upstairs, but emotionally, spiritually, it's a harder sell. It's harder to get through. And when it comes to poetry, I know how feverishly I have raced to perfect my verse. Like there's some finish line with the perfect poem. I still think from time to time, God, when will I get there? When will my poetry be something that flows from perfect impulse, from seed of a thought to stirring words deftly assembled? When will my work make waves? But the journey is where experience accrues, where moments inspire unexpectedly, where we become our authentic selves, where good poetry happens. To pull from someone a little more recent, the great Michelle Obama, for me, she wrote, "Becoming isn't about arriving somewhere or achieving a certain aim. I see it instead as a forward motion, a means of evolving, a way to reach continuously toward a better self. The journey doesn't end." And to be present in this journey, you have to be wholly and patiently yourself. You can't rush being. And honestly, why would you want to? Get faster to death? Being is why we're here, and the uniqueness of our being is what makes our work, in my case poetry, such a powerful expression. Or put more eloquently from the great Gerard Manley Hopkins, one of my favorites, "Each mortal thing does one thing and the same. Deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came." The best poetry I am learning does not desire much than to just be an expression, pure and unedited of oneself. That is enough. and the world will judge the rest. And the genuineness in that poetry, when it can be captured, is worth sharing with the world. But finding and capturing it, that takes time, and only happens when you enjoy the journey walking, not running, with eyes wide open, heart true to self.